We're very privileged to have Fernando Gomez, who is the owner of the Museo de Historia del Mormonismo in Mexico, the museum right next to the temple there. He is sponsoring next Saturday a history fair on the LDS Church in South America. We have a flyer, but he also has some information. If any of you are interested in that, that'll be in the Hotel Courtyard Marriott in Salt Lake City, and it will be a very exciting experience for all of us, and we're happy to have him here and ask you to talk to him about that. Henri Gooren is a good friend who has been involved in studying religion in Latin America for a long time. I first met him, I don't know, 14 years ago, 10 years ago? 17 years ago. When he came as a student, he was writing his thesis on the history of the LDS Church in Costa Rica, and gave me a copy afterwards, and you're welcome to read it. I can't read it because it was in Dutch. But he then did his PhD on the LDS Church as other churches in Guatemala, and I have a copy of that book. And now he's slowly making it through all of the countries of Central America. His focus really isn't on Mormonism in his latest research, but because of his interest, he's able to connect that with it, and we're very happy for that. He is presently a researcher and coordinator for the program Conversion, Careers, and Cultural Politics in Protestantism, and is a researcher and coordinator at the Central IIMO for Intercultural Theology at Utrecht University. He just recently accepted a position at Oakland University in Michigan, so he'll be here in the United States, and we'll be able to see him more often, I'm hopefully, because of that. He's been active. He's here. This is his fourth talk here in Utah, so he's very tired. Probably, but we took him up to Bear Lake yesterday and really tired him out. Showed him that part of Utah and Idaho, which I think was an enjoyable trip. But anyway, we're very pleased to have you here, Henri.
Well, thank you, Mark. I guess I'll be recuperating from the Bear Lake trip here by giving a lecture at the Kennedy Center, so I'm really glad to be back here. I'm going to talk to you, as the title read, on Mormons in Nicaragua. The title is Latter-day Saints Under Siege, the Unique Experience of Nicaraguan Mormons. Now, this talk will actually also be published in the next issue of Dialogue that I guess will be coming out in a couple of months. As you all know, the LDS Church is currently gaining many new members in Asia, Africa, and especially Latin America. Nowadays, more than 35% of the worldwide membership is concentrated in Latin America, compared to about 45% in the United States and Canada. By the year 2020, the majority of the Mormons in the world will actually be Latin Americans if the current growth rates continue. And again, judging from the current LDS growth rates, the future Mormon heartland would be the Andes and the Central American countries instead of the Wasatch Front. Now, I do think that sociologist Rodney Stark is exaggerating when he labels Mormonism the next world religion, since he ignores a dropout rate for converts that generally exceeds 50%. 1 year after joining the LDS Church, at best only about half of the new converts remain active, meaning that they attend church services at least once a month. Now, as I said, Latin America now contains more than 1/3 of the worldwide LDS membership, but the members are certainly not equally divided among the 19 countries. I have a table, obviously, in the Dialogue article showing that. Numerically, the Mormon Church in Latin America is currently strongest in Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, Honduras, and Central America as a whole, Peru, Ecuador, and the Dominican Republic. In all of these countries, between 1% and 3% of the population has been baptized in the LDS Church. To assess in which countries the Mormon Church is growing, of course, a look at the recent average annual growth rates is necessary. And they also have a table on that. And if you look at that, you can see that membership growth currently seems to be stagnating in all of the Central American countries except Nicaragua that experienced strong growth in the 1990s. And also in other countries where the LDS presence is strong, like Chile, Uruguay, and then also some other countries like Colombia and Puerto Rico. But The situation in other Latin American countries is radically different. If you look at the recent growth rates for 2003 and 2004, and also 2004-2005, the LDS Church is currently experiencing its strongest membership increases in Brazil, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Paraguay, and especially Nicaragua, which is of course all the more reason to take an in-depth look at the distinctive experience of Mormons in Nicaragua. Now, the main thesis of this dialogue article is that Mormon growth in Nicaragua was directly influenced by the country's turbulent political context. But how did historical and political developments affect LDS growth? To address that question, I first give a short overview of my data and methods. Subsequent sections will deal with the early history of the LDS Church in Nicaragua, the occupation of LDS Church buildings in Nicaragua, the underground Mormon Church in the Sandinista era, decade, basically the 1980s, the re-establishment of the LDS Church in 1991, and then the LDS growth explosion in the 1990s. And I conclude with a short summary and some tentative projections. Now, the principal source of information here is my fieldwork in Managua, Nicaragua in 2005 and 2006. As Mark was saying, I studied competition for members between various religious groups. Catholic groups, especially the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, which are basically the Pentecostal Catholics. Also various Protestant Pentecostal and Neo-Pentecostal churches, and then I also included the Mormon Church. I engaged in participant observation in these churches in two low-income neighborhoods of Managua, Barrio Monseñor Lescano in West Managua, Barrio Bello Horizonte in the east. And then I also interviewed various church leaders, church members, missionaries, of course conducted a literature study. As Mark said, my research project is part of an international research program which studies global Pentecostalism on 4 continents. All research projects use standardized checklists for the interviews and participant observations. The so-called conversion careers approach includes a typology which distinguishes 5 levels of religious participation: disaffiliation, pre-affiliation, affiliation, conversion, and what we call confession. And in all 4 continents, interviews are conducted with members corresponding to each of these 5 categories. Now, what I'm going to talk about here, my findings here in Nicaragua, all come from the Lescano ward, which shared the building with the Las Palmas ward, people from another poor neighborhood in West Managua. Lescano ward officially had 260 members in 2005, but only about 120 of these were active, about 46%. The bishop reported church attendance on Sunday was generally about 120, but I usually counted between 60 and 80 people. Now, in the article, there is some more information, of course, on Nicaragua, which I'm going to skip here, because and there's also information on the situation of churches in Nicaragua, the growth of Protestantism. I'm just going to say that, of course, Catholicism was Nicaragua's official religion until the early 20th century. So that's only a century ago. In 1963, still 96% of the population considered itself Roman Catholic. By 2005, however, the percentage of Catholics had decreased remarkably to almost 60%. This is a huge decrease, right? From 96 to 60% in about 40 years. Of course, during the same period, the percentage of Protestants has gone up correspondingly from 4 to almost 25%. So there are currently over 2.5 million Roman Catholics in Nicaragua, an estimated 1 million Protestants, and over 52,000 Latter-day Saints. Now, I'll give you a short history of the LDS Church in Nicaragua, which is quite similar to other Central American countries. The first missionaries of the LDS Church arrived in Nicaragua in 1953, less than 1 year after the founding of the Central American Mission in Guatemala City. The LDS Church had been present in neighboring Costa Rica already since 1946, and in Honduras since 1952. Like elsewhere in Central America, growth in Nicaragua was very slow in the first decade. The first Nicaraguan was only baptized in mid-1954, and the Nicaragua district of the Central American Mission was organized in 1959. The 1950s and 1960s were characterized by local church building, foundation and consolidation of branches and wards. And the church always made an effort to maintain smooth relationships with the Somoza family, the dictators who ruled Nicaragua, to ensure the freedom to proselytize. The oldest LDS church buildings in Managua date from the mid-1960s, including the Lescano Ward Meeting House and the Meeting House in East Managua, Barrio Belo Horizonte. Nicaragua now has 2 missions, but as yet no LDS temple. Members have been going to the Guatemala City Temple since 1984. As I said, church growth remained slow in Nicaragua for a very long time, and I have a long table showing that. By the end of 1979, right after the Sandinista Revolution, there were 3,346 Mormon members on record. 1 year later, membership dropped by almost 30%, resulting in 2,406 members by the end of 1980. Throughout the 1980s, the membership statistics fluctuated significantly. To explain why this happened, a closer look at the Sandinista decade is necessary. Now I have more detailed information on occupation of church buildings, by the Sandinista defense committees. On August 9, 1982, Sandinista defense committees seized more than 20 Adventist, Mormon, and Jehovah's Witness buildings in various Managua neighborhoods. The Sandinista leadership claimed that these seizures were spontaneous reactions by the people, responding to the, quote, theological backwardness of the groups in question. But then there's an American anthropologist, David Stoll, who did some research on that and who basically concluded that there were also very practical reasons. Some of the commandantes who really had their eyes on these really nice church buildings and wanted to use them for their own purposes. Then, of course, the occupation of church buildings was also an anti-American reaction to the increased hostility of the Reagan administration towards the Sandinistas. In line with Thomas Borger's accusations, who was one of the Sandinista commandantes, Adventists, witnesses, and Mormons were singled out as American churches with CIA connections. During these months, August 1982, some North American missionaries were harassed by mobs in downtown Managua, and I have some information on that also. Let me go to the story of the bishop of the Lescano ward, Daniel, who had been a bishop there for 8 years, which is not uncommon in Central America. Born in mountainous Esteli on the 8th of May 1961, he joined the LDS Church in 1988 at age 26. At that time, he was working in Managua as a taxi driver by day and studying law at night at the university. He says that he grew up in a family that was, quote, neither rich nor poor. When he was a child, various relatives took him to visit their churches, Catholic Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostal churches. He says that he didn't like any of them because he saw so much hypocrisy in there. And that at 9 he didn't want to go to any church anymore. And he occasionally got into fights at school and on the streets. By the time he was 12, he became even more rebellious. He ran away from his Esteli home after he says he was brainwashed, quote, at school by Sandinista instructors talking about the oppression of the people by Somoza's brutal dictatorship. And Daniel was actually a Sandinista guerrilla fighter for many years. Various times, he says, he barely escaped death when farmers would tell him to leave their house because the Guardia Nacional, Somoza's National Guard, was coming. Many times, he says, bullets passed by close to him. He was then eventually caught by Somoza's National Guard and beaten, although not tortured, and his father managed to obtain his release. Afterwards, Daniel was religious and a Christian, but still not a member of any church. The first time the Mormon missionaries came knocking at his door, he sent them away angrily. But he says, the second time they came, his heart has changed completely. He received all of the discussions, the charlas, and very soon got baptized. Now, Daniel was already completely disillusioned with the Sandinistas around 1985, when he saw that they were beginning to break their promises of democracy and freedom. He says that they became corrupt. They reinstated compulsory military service during the Contra War, and of course, the Sandinista militants also occupied the Mormon church buildings. The Mormon building in San Judas, a very poor neighborhood in the south of Managua, was vandalized and damaged so seriously it had to be demolished and rebuilt entirely. The Lescano meeting house, again the word I studied, became a military base for the Sandinista People's Army, the Ejército Popular Sandinista. The buildings were returned only after the elections of 1990, badly damaged and stripped of furniture. The fierce persecution of the LDS Church by the Sandinista government proved to Daniel that it was the only true church, because he says that only the true church would be the target of such aggressive state persecution. Just like the LDS missionary who confronted an angry mob that I talked about before, Daniel placed this persecution firmly within a religious framework. Now I'll tell you a bit about the underground Mormon church that functioned in Nicaragua from 1982 to 1990. The Mormon missionaries of North American origin were all withdrawn from Nicaragua in 1982, although the Latin American missionaries were almost always present, according to Daniel. Between 1982 and 1989, almost one-third of all baptized Mormons in Nicaragua officially left the church or were dropped from membership. From August 1992 until January of 1991, the Mormon church in Nicaragua effectively functioned underground. The church decided to change its 4 wards into branches, making a total of 13 branches. Since there is no literature on this period, I rely on Daniel, the former Lescano ward bishop, and this is what Daniel told me, quote, "We met in secret in the homes of some members. These were called the nucleos, the centers, the cores. We always met in the house of members. It was very hard at this time, but the church went ahead because it's the church of the Lord. We didn't meet very often. There weren't very many of us." End of quote. He remembers that there were so few Melchizedek priesthood holders left in the church that the missionaries had to perform blessings and preside over the underground nucleo meetings in members' houses until the late 1980s. Daniel often accompanied the missionaries because their dress code and their appearance in peers made them very conspicuous in the poor neighborhoods of Managua. He had to take them to the members' homes too because the missionaries always has trouble finding the locations, the directions. Anybody who's tried to find an address in Managua knows where that comes from. Between 1982 and 1990, most Mormons were afraid to tell co-workers or relatives that they were Mormons. Mormons in Nicaragua were effectively under siege from their own government. And in the process, only the most committed core members remained. All the other members, active and inactive, put their LDS identity on hold or actually took on membership in another church. It was only after President Violeta Barrios de Chamorro came to power in January of 1991, after surprisingly winning the November 1990 elections, that state harassment of the Mormon church in Nicaragua ended and that the missionaries, also the North American missionaries, could return. After Doña Violeta was sworn in as president in January of 1991, there was a huge reshuffling of government and bureaucracy positions at all levels of the state. And the persecution and isolation of the Mormon church came to an immediate end in January of 1991. The LDS Church was re-established officially. Its members and missionaries were free to proselytize again, just as they had been before 1979 during the Somoza regime. The first North American missionaries were reassigned to Nicaragua in mid-1991, and all meeting houses were returned to the LDS Church. Daniel remembers that people in the poor Las Palmas and Lescano neighborhoods still remained very hostile to Mormons for a long time in the 1990s when he was a bishop. He says that they regularly threw stones through the meeting house windows, and that thieves from a nearby slum would often break in and steal things. Relationships with neighborhood dwellers improved only after the LDS Church became involved in the relief efforts following Hurricanes Joan in 1988 and especially Hurricane Mitch in 1998. Since then, he says, the relationships with the municipality of Managua and with the national government have been excellent. LDS buildings are sometimes used for organizing big neighborhood meetings, and the current positive image of Mormons is reflected in the growth explosion the church has experienced since 1990. Now, I have a lot of information also on this growth explosion, of which I'm only going to give you a summary now. Basically, there are 4 growth periods in Nicaragua after 1953. First period goes from 53 to 65, Unfortunately, we have no membership data available on Nicaragua, only on the whole Central American mission. Then, in the second period, which goes from 1966 to 1980, there is strongly fluctuating growth, with average annual growth rates between minus 28 and plus 48%. So there's really big swings up and down. And then the third period is the one I've just been talking about, the 1980s, the Sandinista era. There was a decrease of membership for about 1/3 in total. And then the fourth period, which started in 1990 and goes on until today, this is a period of very high growth, a real growth explosion, with an average annual growth rate of about 13% for the whole period. Now, there are some extremes, it's somewhere between 7% in some years, and the high is like 25%. The moment is like 10% growth a year, which is pretty good, for Latin America and elsewhere in the world. So let me tell you a bit about these periods, concentrating on especially the second period from 1966 to 1980, period again of fluctuating growth. I would say at that time, the late 60s, 70s, the main growth factor was actually non-religious and external, various types of social, political, psychological anomie, normlessness. The city of Managua was growing very quickly at this time. And because of the war between Somoza's National Guard and the Sandinista rebels, guerrillas, the missionaries were periodically withdrawn from Nicaragua also at this time. Religious competition with other churches, especially the Pentecostals, increased in the 1970s. And then there was the big 1972 earthquake, which killed more than 10,000 people and left more than 50,000 homeless. A time of great chaos and turmoil. Now, I've discussed already the third period, the 1980s, when the country is still at war. All families suffered the impact of mandatory military service, inflation, poverty skyrocketed. But also during the 1980s, and this is very important, membership in the Pentecostal churches skyrocketed. Pentecostals successfully competed with, and you could say out-baptized, the Mormons. The appeal of the LDS organization decreased because of the government harassment and the confiscation of LDS buildings. These events obviously make the social costs of being a Mormon very high. The LDS Church was forced to go underground and lost almost 1/3 of its members. And of course, the missionaries were barred from entering the country. Now, as soon as this period ended, transition to the government of Chamorro, the LDS Church regained a strong appeal with Nicaraguans after 1990. And now the former government harassment became part of the unique local experience and local history of Mormons in Nicaragua. The harassment had increased the commitment of the members who had remained faithful to the church. And now the previous Sandinista harassment made the Mormon church actually more popular, because becoming a Mormon could be construed as an act of rebellion against the Sandinistas. So it's interesting that you also see many disillusioned Sandinista militants were actually baptized in the Mormon church in this period. Also, in the same period, the 1990s, becoming a Mormon showed a rejection of the interference of the Roman Catholic Cardinal Obando y Bravo and the Roman Catholic Church in general in national politics. The anomie factor was still high because of poverty and political instability, but the LDS missionaries were again permitted to enter the country and proselytize freely, which is a very important growth factor for the LDS Church. And very important also, religious competition with the Pentecostals was less fierce, as the Pentecostal growth rates were slowly decreasing in the 1990s, so it's sort of crossing. Pentecostal growth rates go down, Mormon growth rates go up. So, in conclusion, how did historical and political developments in Nicaragua affect LDS growth? The LDS Church was forced to maintain good relationships with the Somoza dictators to ensure that its missionary force would not be hindered. As the war between Somoza's National Guard and the Sandinista guerrillas culminated in the late 1970s, LDS growth went up. But when the Sandinistas took over in 1979 and gradually started to harass the LDS Church and its members, growth went down dramatically. As I said, almost 1/3 of all registered members left, but the commitment among those who remained was strengthened by the persecution, as witnessed by Bishop Daniel's story. The LDS Church was under siege from its own government and was forced to go underground from 1982 until 1990s. Many disillusioned Sandinista militants found in the apolitical LDS Church a new purpose and a chance to use their leadership capabilities. When the Sandinistas were surprisingly ousted in the 1990 elections, the LDS Church was formally re-established and the North American missionaries could work unhindered again. So various factors, I would say, coincided to produce the LDS membership explosion in Nicaragua of the 1990s. An end to state persecution, an increased commitment among the remaining LDS members, the growth of the missionary force, growing dissatisfaction among Nicaraguans with the politicized Catholicism, and a decrease in the competition with Pentecostal churches. Like elsewhere in Latin America, the Mormon Church was popular for many, many different reasons. In part spiritual reasons, but in part also social reasons, like its efficient organization, which radiated success and middle-class values, its solemn style of worship and hymns, its lay priesthood for men, its strict rules of conduct, its practical teachings, and of course its unique doctrines stressing eternal spiritual progress. But the growth explosion in Nicaragua came at a price, the same price paid earlier in Guatemala and Costa Rica. The weak local LDS organization and leadership could not cope with the sudden influx of new members. Various traits and conflicts resulting from such cultural patterns as machismo influenced this. The net result was that at least half of the new converts became inactive within a year after joining the Mormon Church. Among the active Mormons, again only about half became core members who consistently attended church services, performed in their callings, paid their tithes, and followed the word of wisdom. Now I think this big difference between active and inactive Mormons sheds a new light on sociologist Rodney Stark's high estimate of 267 million, think of this figure, 267 million Mormons by the year 2080. Stark is simply projecting the high growth rates into the future, ignoring both the eventual decrease in growth after 5 to 10 years and ignoring the high inactivity rate of at least 50%, and in many parts it's more like 70 or 75% inactivity. Now, it is important to stress that the period of explosive growth in Nicaragua for Mormonism immediately followed that of Pentecostal explosive growth in the 1980s. A similar phenomenon happened in Guatemala, where the Pentecostal explosion took place between 1976 and 1982, and a Mormon growth explosion followed in the late 1980s. Now, although the situation is obviously different from one country to another, I think this timing hints at an interesting relationship between Mormon and Pentecostal growth. In another article, I have contrasted the more rational, intellectual appeal of Mormonism with the more emotional and experiential appeal of Pentecostalism. Since most converts to Pentecostalism used to be nominal Catholics, I hypothesize that joining the Mormon Church is probably easier for former Pentecostals than for former Catholics. Now, Pentecostals are also more successful in mobilizing their entire membership to act as missionaries to bring in new converts. I know this is the ideal also in the Mormon Church, but I'm sure you know it doesn't always work out like that, especially in Latin America. I showed in this article that fierce competition with Pentecostals slowed LDS growth in Nicaragua in the 1980s, while decreased Pentecostal competition led to increased Mormon growth, as happened in the 1990s. The Mormon missionaries also arrived in massive numbers in the 1990s, coinciding with the period of the LDS boom in Nicaragua. This finding confirms that of various scholars that the single most important factor influencing LDS growth is the size of the missionary force. Finally, I would speculate that the religious market, competition between churches for members, always functions with a certain time lag. People may need some time to become used to new religious options before they are willing to try them out. Now, like I said, this intriguing relationship between the timing of Pentecostal and Mormon growth obviously requires further study. then I think it's also highly tempting to speculate about the future of the LDS Church in Nicaragua and elsewhere in Latin America. In 2006, the last year when I did fieldwork there in Managua, there were already 7 LDS stakes in Nicaragua, up from 4 stakes only 3 years earlier. So that's adding about a stake a year. I expect that in the coming years, the construction of a small LDS temple in Managua will be announced. If Nicaragua follows the growth patterns of Guatemala and Costa Rica, then in 5 to 10 years, its average annual growth rates will decrease, like in those countries, to about 2 to 3% a year, which is actually about population growth. So that's one way of saying it's stagnating or it's stabilizing. The Mormon Church seems to concentrate its missionaries in those countries where the prospects for growth are best at that time. If this policy is continued, I suspect Nicaragua may still be among these countries for at least another 5 to 10 years. Afterwards, a higher percentage of missionaries will probably go to countries like Paraguay, Bolivia, Dominican Republic, and later perhaps to future growth markets like Colombia and Venezuela. This article and dialogue has shown that internal wars or anti-American governments in Latin American countries will at best only delay Mormon growth. So, one day, when the war in Colombia ends at last, and when Hugo Chavez marches out of his office in Venezuela, LDS growth rates in those countries are likely to increase as part of a catching up process, just like happened in Nicaragua in the 1990s. Thank you very much.
We have plenty of time for questions, so are there any questions?
Yeah.
The political leader who was in charge of, I guess, who was head of the Sandinista movement, Daniel Ortega, recently re-elected. Has that had any kind of effect, or is your data further past than that?
You mean whether the recent election of Daniel Ortega as president of Nicaragua in January has affected Mormon growth there?
Growth of all religions.
It is, again, my fieldwork ended in 2006, so I don't have direct data on it myself, although I've just been writing also an article on the situation of churches in Nicaragua. One thing I did notice is that Ortega had a very successful election campaign that talked, very in contrast to his older image of, this anti-American revolutionary. His image during the election campaign was very moderate. He was dressed in white, traveling all over the country, talking about peace, reconciliation, Jesus Christ, the importance of religion in his life. So this was a different Daniel Ortega, a new man Daniel Ortega, you could almost say. His image has certainly changed. He's become closer to the Catholic Church. He's saying things that very carefully don't want to alienate the Pentecostal churches. So he's quite open to that. Of course, the Sandinista legacy is only in part anti-religion. They were not like these hardline Eastern European, atheist communists, like anything like that. But they were pretty strong on the revolution, and they were pretty critical towards those churches that did not support the revolutionary project as they saw it. And they sort of singled out the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Adventists among those, but also some of the Pentecostals that were anti-Sandinista. Now, like I said, I think we're talking about a different type of Daniel this time. But at the same time, if you look at his rhetorics now that he's in government, he certainly moved closer again to not so much Fidel Castro, but certainly Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Now, again, I don't know. I haven't been in Nicaragua for about a year. I could say that part of this is simply rhetorics. I could also say that there are very practical reasons for this, because Ortega made a very good deal with Chavez that Nicaragua will get cheap oil from Venezuela. So again, I can see there are very practical reasons for him to not alienate the sort of political family of the left in Latin America. And of course, you may know that in many countries in South America at the moment, we have basically leftist or leftish, I should say, perhaps, governments. So in a sense, it makes sense for Ortega not wanting to alienate those. At the same time, it is certainly a different Ortega from the 1980s. And on some issues, also on some ethical issues like abortion, he has become a lot more conservative than he than he was in the, I guess, 1970s, 1980s. And how that will end up, I guess we'll have to learn, because he's only been in office since January. But it will be very interesting to watch. It will be very interesting what happens in his relationships both to the Catholic Church and to the Pentecostal churches, and then the Mormon Church. But there won't be any seizing of Mormon church buildings happening in these years. I cannot really see that happening. Of course, any researcher who says that immediately thinks, what happens if next year there are some mobs and attack the churches? I don't see it happening, but you never know. But it's an interesting time in Nicaragua, And actually, I was thinking the other day, it's interesting that both in Nicaragua and Costa Rica, you have the same heads of government that were there about 25, 30 years ago. You have Oscar Arias, who was re-elected in Costa Rica, and you have Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And they both hate each other. They still hate each other very much. So it doesn't say very well, for Costa Rica and Nicaraguan relationships, I'm afraid. But it's an interesting situation. We'll have to wait what happens. Any more questions? Sure.
El Salvador, since I lived in Los Angeles at all the times we were talking about, most of our people that were coming up to us from Central America were coming from El Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any sort of parallels? So those are a huge part of my friends at that first time. Is there any sort of parallels that you know of that are with? I know they're fairly close, but I'm not sure exactly how close.
What you mean?
But the histories are very close.
The histories are close.
What's happening in El Salvador too, because the El Salvadoreños were coming up to us from Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
We had so many friends that were just from El Salvador. So nobody was from Nicaragua, nobody was Nicaraguan, but El Salvadoreños.
So your question is whether, from Salvador there was... I'd be curious about that. If you talk about immigration factor, that would be similar. Like you say, many Salvadorans went to Los Angeles, went to the U.S. This has happened also in Nicaragua. There's been a huge immigration, migration from Nicaragua to the U.S. Now, I don't know. I haven't seen any data on that, but I'd be very curious. I would guess many of those would have been Mormons already before they left. But I'd be very curious to see if, but that is a different subject, whether Latin immigration from Central America to the U.S. I've seen some reports that, many of these Latins joined Pentecostal churches in the U.S. I haven't seen any research. I don't know who's doing research on that, on, Latins who go to the U.S., to the Los Angeles area or the Miami area, and whether they join the Mormon church there. Again, I would say it's an important issue, but, frankly, I don't have information on that. I will say that one thing that surprised me in Nicaragua, these are really poor neighborhoods where I did my research. And in every family, whether Catholics, Pentecostals, or Mormons, they would have at least one or two family members working in the U.S. Every family. I cannot think of any family that didn't have at least one relative working in the U.S. I didn't ask them whether they were like legal residents or not, but they would have at least one of them working in the U.S. Now, this is a huge group. There are estimates of perhaps up to 1 million Nicaraguans living in the U.S., which would be 1/5 of the population. Now, I don't believe it's 1 million, but it will be more than 500,000, perhaps even up to 700,000. This is a huge group. This huge type of immigration obviously affects people's ties to churches. It opens up new opportunities. It opens up new networks for them, in the U.S. and when they go back to Nicaragua. But again, as you say, I think it's an interesting theme for research, but I wouldn't know any people who are working on that. So if anybody has an idea who's working on that, I'd be very interested in hearing it. More questions or comments?
Yeah, you're suggesting that there's a connection between people the growth of Pentecostalism, which goes down, and the growth of Mormonism going up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really an interesting thing that I've never heard anybody,
Mm-hmm.
Do you see it as a theological, you've mentioned both. What do you really believe? Do you see it as a theological? Do you see it as Pentecostals leaving the Pentecostal church and then searching for Mormonism so the growth occurs then? What's the reason here?
Well, like I said, there are country differences. I've seen this phenomenon, I mentioned Guatemala, but I've also seen it in Costa Rica, where you have the same phenomenon, Pentecostal growth in the 70s and mid-80s, and then Mormon growth in the late 80s and early 90s. Like I said, I can speculate on many things that might be happening there. I can see a certain pattern. I can see some issues that are unique for the countries, like in Nicaragua. You really have this unique situation of a government that was against the Mormon Church, the whole underground church. That is an important part of history in Nicaragua. I guess it would be, I don't know, come to think of it, it would not be impossible for both churches to have an explosion at the same time. I cannot really think, I'm thinking of the literature, in Guatemala. It's usually assumed, if you read the books, that all of these churches get there in the 60s and then you have the growth explosion in the 70s. And the suggestion is usually that it happens about at the same time if you read David Martin or Virginia Guard Burnett. But, as I say, if you look really closely to the figures, it's one following the other. And again, I'm still struggling with it. I speculated on various things. I would have to do some more detailed analysis and go back to the figures on all of these countries. One of my future projects is to also include the other Central American countries, Panama, which would be a very interesting case, Honduras would be an interesting case, and again, El Salvador will be a very interesting case, to see if that happens. And then, I guess I am reluctant because by American standards, small countries in Central America have some big cultural differences. And although their history is similar, there are some cultural and identity issues that really set these countries apart from each other. So it is, again, hard to generalize and just say, because it happens in two countries, it must be a general process. It could still be a coincidence. Like I said, I could imagine that it might be easier once you've left the Catholic Church and joined the Pentecostals, and you don't like the Pentecostals and you try the Mormons. So one of the theories is that the circulation of believers, what they call the circulation of the saints actually, might be a phenomenon also affecting it. Once you're open to leaving a church, once you've left one church, it might be easier to leave a second church or a third church. So that might be another factor. Just, growing religious mobility, growing religious options, a very vibrant religious market. It's hard to remember. Well, I guess it's hard to imagine for Dutch people. For Americans, it's easy to imagine all of these churches on the radio, on the television, out on the streets. Yeah, here we have some interesting cultural differences between, I guess, Holland and the US. In Holland, this is very different. Holland is a very thoroughly secularized country. You get the religious messages, but they're basically directed at the people who are religious, who are a minority in society. In Holland, you have only people who say they are religious is about 40-50% of the population. Then the people who go to church is about 10% at best, I would say. So that is a different situation. And Latin America is much closer to the US on this count. It's a vibrant religious market. It has huge religious mobility now. It has poverty, immigration. So you have a whole host of factors combining, I guess, offering people different options, people trying them out, perhaps try out one or two options. And I've seen different, reports on that research. I always thought that most people in Central America would have been a member of at least 3 or 4 or 5 churches. But if you look at the country surveys, it's very hard to get reliable statistical data in Central America. We have to rely on national census data, which are very scarce. Nicaragua is a good one, but it's only 2005 and 1995. Or you have to rely on seat Gallup polls. Basically, Gallup polls, they have an office in Central America also. You see some interesting phenomena. You see a growing category of people who say they have no religion. Now, they are there in the polls as no religion, but actually it should say no church, because if you talk to these people, most of them are still religious. They say, I'm still a Christian, but I don't think you need to go to church anymore. And you might actually find some inactive Mormons there who also say, I'm still a Mormon, I still practice the word of wisdom, I just don't go to church anymore because I ran into problems with my bishop or some of the members. So you have this interesting category that has grown in Central America, no religion. Some European scholars have said, there you have a secularization in Central America. I don't believe in that. It's not the type of secularization you have in Holland where people who really have no religion, they are secular. What you have is less people who are churched. And I think it's part of the mobilization part, the circulation parts. People have tried out a few churches. But you also have questions in the polls. How many churches have you belonged to? And then generally, people have only merely belonged to churches 1 or 2. Rarely you have 3. So that goes against this idea that this is high mobility and people trying out different religious options, as of trying out different cars. It doesn't work like that. Apparently there are some breaks, so to say, on it, some limits to it, that people are not really experimenting with that many churches. People would try out a church if they get invited by friends or by family. They don't just go out in a neighborhood and see, what churches are here, shall I visit them? People only go to visit a new church if they're invited by family or friends. That's what you find most. So I guess then it's limited because, some families may have, like Danielle's family, 3 different churches in it, but most families are pretty homogeneous, I would say. You get Catholics, you may have Catholics and Pentecostals, but you rarely get 3 or 4 churches within one family. Again, it's very hard to piece this all together. It's very hard to get the statistical material. What I now saw is based on what I've seen in San Jose, Costa Rica, Guatemala City, and Managua. It is very hard to really do good data on this and get good comparative data. Do surveys, statistical research is very, very hard in Nicaragua and in Latin America in general, and Central America, and religion is a really hard subject because the way you phrase the question, do you belong to a church, or do you attend a church, or are you a Catholic? I mean, many people, if you phrase it like, are you a Catholic? Many people might say yes, even though they never go to church. So it's very important to ask, what church are you attending? Or what church do you sympathize with? Or have you been to other churches in the past years? But it's very hard to do this type of research well. And then it very much depends on to have good investigators from Gallup going out to visiting people at their homes and asking the right questions and writing it down well. There's a lot of methodological problems involved with this. But still, we make do, we do our best, we try to piece it together, and that's what we have basically. More questions or comments? Yes? Well, let's ask you first and then come back to you. Yeah. Yeah, let's go to you first and then.
Is there a master list of your research papers? Excuse me? A master list of your research papers that we can take a look at?
The question is there a list of my research publications on, I guess you'll be talking mostly on Mormons in Central America. Mark Grover, who's the BYU librarian, has, I guess, access to all of that and, has all of my publications. There's not that much. There's a dissertation, there's a couple of articles in Dialogue, older articles on Guatemala, and there's the new one coming up now in a couple of months on Nicaragua. And then, well, you may know that there is a new anthology being prepared to commemorate Thomas O'Day's The Mormons, the study of 50 years ago. There'll be a new volume out, which is called Remembering O'Day's The Mormons. I have an article in that looking at Mormon identity in Central America, also comparing the countries, look at what are the central elements of the Mormon identity in Central America. That book will be published by University of Utah Press in January of 2008. So there's a couple of things, I guess, coming up in the near future. And I guess there's more coming up in the far future, but that even I am not aware of at this moment. Any more questions or comments? You had a question also.
As you studied the history of the church in Central America, have you been able to tell if the construction of a temple has any significant impact on the growth of the church in that area?
Yeah, the question is whether the construction of a temple has significant impact on the growth of the church in that area and that country of Central America. Of course, the case that comes to mind immediately is Costa Rica, where the temple was opened in 2002. I'd be wanting to go back to Costa Rica to check on that. I've been back to Costa Rica, but mostly for family and holiday matters, and so I haven't really followed up on that. I'd have to... Actually, come to think of it, the short answer is no, because if you look at what I mentioned at the growth rates in Costa Rica and Guatemala, they've been stagnating over the last few years. And that is right after the opening of the temple. So I guess the short answer would be, if you look only at the numbers, again, you cannot go only on the numbers. You have to think of the whole activity and activity thing. But if you only go by the numbers, then you would have to say, no, there was no significant impact. Of course, if you think back to Guatemala in 1984, there was a significant impact, but I don't think that was the temple. Guatemala, it was, the growth explosion of Mormons there started in about 85, 86, but again, I think that has more to do with the fact that by then Pentecostal growth had really gone down. I guess I still struggle with this idea. Like I said, it's not inherently impossible for Pentecostals and Mormons to have strong growth at the same time, but I just haven't seen it happening in those countries. I guess I'll have to really look hard for a case where I see it happening and then try to understand the dynamics. I still struggle with this. I find it very interesting, but I still am at a loss to really fully explain it. Okay, first you and then you, yeah?
I was wondering if there's any Native American tribes down there and if the church is stronger within those tribes than there are with the regular tribes.
Yeah, the question is whether there are any Native American tribes there in Nicaragua you're talking about, but the church will be growing. Again, the short answer is I don't know exactly. First of all, there aren't that many Indians in Nicaragua. They're heavily concentrated on the Caribbean coast, the Mosquito Indians, and they are very heavily Protestant, Moravian, and as far as I know, they haven't been changing very much. So there is some minor Mormon proselytizing there, but there was no major growth. And the other question?
Yeah, the Catholic Church, do you see any change in its decline, I guess, in the numbers?
The question is whether I see any, what was it, difference in the decline in numbers?
Yeah, do you see it continuing going down, or is it bumps up, or what?
It is still going down heavily, the Catholic Church. And actually, it's interesting, if you look at the real recent data that I wasn't able to put into this, but I have in another paper in Holland. The last data, which include the 2005 census and a seed Gallup poll of 2007, the LDS Church has, the Catholic Church has, the percentage of people who say they belong to the Catholic Church has decreased remarkably over the last 5 years. In my paper analyzing Ortega's election victory, I made the relationship that Cardinal Obando y Bravo has been very heavily supporting former President Arnoldo Alemán, even when it was already clear that he was very corrupt, he was out in these trials, he was convicted, he was in jail, and still Cardinal Obando kept supporting him and speaking out in favor of him and saying that people should be just. And this created a lot of annoyance with the Nicaraguan population, and it really damaged the image of the Catholic Church, especially in the period when the end of the Alemán government, 2001, 2002, and then when he got sent to jail 2003, it really affected the image of the Catholic Church. So I'm speculated that is one of the reasons why you see after 2001 a decrease in the people who say they're Catholics. And it's interesting, then you see a small Pentecostal boom again. The number of people who say that they're Pentecostals in the same period goes up. So again, I would speculate there is some sort of relationship, that people are more open to experiment with Pentecostal churches because they were disgusted with some issues in the Catholic Church. Again, this is actually an example of a small Pentecostal boom coinciding with a small LDS boom, because the LDS boom was still going on also in 2001, 2002. So I guess I'll have to go back to those figures and recheck on that. But it is a good question, yeah.